All right. Um, Welcome to this brief review lecture for um, midterms in ethics. Okay, let us begin with the very basic idea. Wait, for a while, of the placement of ethics in philosophy in general. For a while. Set a few things up. All right, it's okay now. You should see the bullet points. All right, ethics is a branch of philosophy, okay, that falls under axiology. Axiology, remember, deals with values, right? Values both aesthetic and moral. Ethics focuses on moral values, asking what is right and wrong, right? What ought to be done and why. Now, um, we also discussed what constitutes a moral problem, right? Issues like, for example, deciding whether to lay off employees or, for example, determining whether to lie or to tell the truth. These are definitely moral dilemmas because they directly engage with the question of what is right and what is wrong. However, choosing between like eating chicken or fish, okay, yes, there's still dilemmas in a sense because they're about what's more healthy or what suits your preferences more. Okay. However, choosing between chicken or fish, okay, to eat does not represent a moral problem. Why? Because it does not involve ethical stakes or even at least harm to others. It's more of a personal preference. Okay? Then we talk about the concept of value. Value um, refers to what one prizes in life, okay, or what one considers important. This might include moral values like honesty, okay, courage, and even personal values like valuing family, valuing success. Recognizing these values help shape moral judgments, guiding decisions in complex situations. Um, we also tackled in our very first meeting the trolley problem, which asks whether you would sacrifice one life to save five. The ethical theory of utilitarianism aligns with sacrificing the one to maximize the greater good, in short to save the five. Yeah. Utilitarianism is grounded in the belief that moral actions are those that produce the greatest happiness for the most number of people. In contrast, the ontology would not support such a decision because the ontology emphasizes the intrinsic rightness or the wrongness of actions, regardless of the outcome. In short, um, to be the cause of the death of one person, okay, is wrong, and therefore you should not do it, no matter the outcome, no matter the consequence. The tension between freedom on the one hand and determinism on the other in moral decision making is, or we have tackled it through the lens of thinkers like John Paul Sartre and Bill Skinner, right? Sartre, as you can recall, um, John Paul Sartre advocates for absolute freedom, asserting that individuals are always free to choose their actions, while Skinner challenges this, suggesting that human behavior is actually largely determined by environmental conditioning. This debate eliminates the complexities of moral responsibility and the extent to which people actually control their actions. Let us consider um, a real world example. Let's consider a nurse facing a dilemma after discovering a cover up of medical negligence. Okay. This situation would be classified as an organizational dilemma. Why? Because the conflict is between the ethical standards of the profession and the unethical practices of the hospital. Okay, take note. This situation is not just about the nurse's personal moral sense, right? But it is actually about upholding professional ethical codes and even possibly influencing systemic change, right? Within, take note, within the institution. Okay. Um, another case in the workplace. When designing an ethics program, it is essential to, to focus on self-reflection and personal responsibility. Why? This is to ensure that employees internalize moral values rather than merely follow external rules. Okay. This approach encourages individuals to take ownership of their moral decisions, fostering a deeper commitment to ethical behavior that is beyond mere compliance. Okay. That's what owning your values refers to, right? Or designates. Think of this case. Consider the case of a tech employee discovering that their company's AI product is being used in ways that violate human rights. Okay. This is a contemporary issue, right? The situation extends actually beyond the personal or even the organizational level, right? Because it presents a systemic dilemma where broader social issues such as human rights violations, right? The right to privacy, so on, must be addressed. The moral responsibility here transcends the individual and even transcends the organization, implicating global standards of ethical conduct. Um, we also talked about Nietzsche, right? And his parable of the madman. The declaration of the madman that, quote, God is dead, end quote, symbolizes the collapse of traditional absolute values. Nietzsche is not merely referring to the death of a religious figure. Instead, he refers to the demise of a moral framework grounded in the divine. This shift throws humanity into a crisis as there are no longer universally accepted standards of good and evil. In this context, ethics must now be constructed by humans themselves, according to Nietzsche, emphasizing the need for personal responsibility in a secular world. Building on Nietzsche, we must also address the challenge of ethical responsibility in a world without traditional sources of moral authority. With, quote, the death of God, Nietzsche argues that humans must take on the burden of creating their own moral values. But this is actually a very enormous task, right? It demands creativity, demands courage, it demands accountability. This responsibility cannot be deferred to religious or even to external systems. Instead, it must be borne by individuals and societies. This call to responsibility, this call to will to power is the emphasis of Nietzsche. Right? Franz Boas offers also a similar but distinct concept, critiquing the, quote, shackles of tradition. He suggests, Boas, he suggests that ethical norms should not be bound by cultural traditions, instead, but should be subject to personal and collective re-evaluation. This aligns with the idea that ethics should evolve with changing societies rather than being confined to the past. Um, let's take a look at another case. Okay, still, let's return to the topic of looking at the levels, okay, the levels of moral or ethical dilemmas. For instance, as a manager, if an employee confides in you about a moral dilemma involving corporate corruption, it's actually what? It's a type of organizational dilemma. It's an example of an organizational dilemma. The conflict involves corporate conduct and the greater good, and the employee's decision could have widespread implications. Guiding them requires understanding of both personal ethics, yes, and the larger moral responsibilities they bear within the organization. And hence it's an organizational dilemma. Wait, wait. Um, well, right. Then we talk about moral development, which refers to the process of working out one's sense of morality through the structuring of personal experiences. Okay, that's moral development. These experiences actually form preferences. They also form behaviors, right, that are deemed acceptable by a referent group. Okay? This gradual progression is fundamental. Why? Because it leads to internalized moral principles that guide future behavior. What concept is referred to here? It's moral development. Such development is actually not static. It evolves over time. It evolves as individuals encounter new challenges and social expectations. Holberg has one of the theories regarding moral development. It's going to call this moral development is active. It's dynamic. It's the dynamic way that we construct and modify our values based on our experiences and those around us. In Kohlberg, there's this pre-conventional stage, there's this conventional stage, there's this post-conventional stage, but we need not talk about all of the details here. Now, let's turn to self-awareness. Self-awareness, okay, has one essential technique. Okay, one of its essential techniques is introspection. Introspection is that it is reflection on our internal states. Okay? Introspection allows us to explore our internal thoughts, our feelings, our own motivations quite deeply. By reflecting on our internal states, we gain clarity on why we act the way we do, making it easier to align our actions with our moral beliefs. What concept is that? That's introspection. Introspection is therefore crucial to personal development. Why? Because it serves as a bridge between our internal world and our outward moral behavior. In moral philosophy, the notion of moral hypocrisy is particularly significant. According to Mayo, moral hypocrisy occurs when individuals outwardly perform moral actions without internalizing their true meaning. This disconnect between action and belief is what defines moral hypocrisy, according to Mayo. It's the semblance, the appearance of moral behavior without the corresponding internal commitment to those values. This highlights the importance of genuine belief and consistency between what we do, okay, in the outside and what we truly stand for, okay, to counter moral hypocrisy, according to Mayo. Mutual expectations, by the way, also play a pivotal role, according to Mayo, in shaping moral behavior. Mayo emphasizes that these expectations are flexible, evolving alongside the social structures within which we operate. These are not rigid commands. Instead, they rather form the subtle framework that influences how we interact with others, ensuring that our actions align with societal norms while still allowing room for individual discretion. All right. Then we talk about the different moral values, okay, in Filipino culture. One of the most deeply ingrained Filipino values is resiliency. While resiliency has historically been a source of strength in the face of adversity, we have this dilemma. Why? Because it can also inhibit social progress. How? By encouraging a passive acceptance of hardship, resiliency may prevent Filipinos from actively seeking solutions to structural problems, thus perpetuating cycles of poverty and cycles of inequality. This idea speaks to the dual nature of cultural values. Okay? They can be empowering, yes, but also at times limiting. Another important Filipino value is pakikisama, right? Or smooth interpersonal relationships. This value fosters cooperation and harmony within groups, but it can again also have a downside. While pakikisama encourages people to get along, it may also discourage constructive criticism and honest feedback, right? Particularly even in work and even in other group settings. Again, this demonstrates how values like pakikisama can sometimes conflict with personal growth and the need for transparency in social and professional dynamics. In many social situations, Filipino values like utang ng loob, okay, or debt of gratitude, and lakas ng loob, right, or strength of character, they often interact. For instance, in community meetings, utang ng loob, okay, can prevent individuals from criticizing authority figures who have previously helped them, right? While lakas ng loob can encourage others to speak out despite personal relationships. This tension, right, between loyalty on the one hand and courage to dissent reflects the complexity of moral and social behavior in Filipino civic engagement. In moral decision making, freedom of the act is a critical component of moral blamefulness. Okay, sorry, moral blameworthiness. For example, a student who witnesses cheating but does not report it may be held morally accountable for failing to act. However, in another scenario, if a student unknowingly plagiarizes due to a lack of understanding of citation rules, the blame may be mitigated. This distinction emphasizes the role of intent, right, and the role of knowledge in moral judgment, as highlighted in the principle of ignorantia legis, which suggests that genuine ignorance can sometimes excuse moral feelings. Now, let's talk about cultural relativism. The debate surrounding cultural relativism offers an important perspective on morality. Proponents of cultural relativism argue that moral norms should be viewed within the context of individual cultures, promoting respect for diversity. Right. However, critics contend that universal rights establish a baseline of moral behavior that transcends cultural boundaries, thus protecting individuals from harmful practices that may be justified under the guise of tradition. It's the downside, you might say, of cultural relativism. This tension between cultural differences and upholding universal moral principles on the other remains essential to contemporary ethical discussions. All right. A key point of moral evaluation is the distinction between acts and character. You know, while individual acts can reveal certain aspects of a person's moral standing, true character is shaped over time, okay, through consistent patterns of behavior. It's long term. A person's character may not always be reflected in isolated actions, but becomes evident in how they respond to various circumstances over a prolonged period of time. Therefore, moral evaluation um, often requires us to look beyond the single acts and consider the broader context of a person's life and behavior. Now, let's go back to um, the constitution of a person, according to, for example, Aquinas. For Aquinas, a human person is constituted by a body and a soul. Okay, body is like matter, whereas the soul is like the form, which informs the body. The the soul, which is immaterial, has two major powers: intellect and will, each of which has its primary object, meaning that towards which it is directed. Okay, the intellect has its primary object, which is truth. The pursuit of truth drives human inquiry and is foundational to our moral and intellectual lives. Remember, powers are directed towards a goal, right? In short, the goal of the power of the soul, which is the intellect, okay, it's directed, its goal is the truth. Truth seeking enables individuals to navigate moral dilemmas and make informed decisions. Okay. There's also this second power, which is the will, okay, which is directed again now to the good. What's good. When discussing objective moral values, we recognize that some principles, like respect for human life, values like our principles like honesty, okay, these are universally acknowledged as inherently good. Okay, the key idea here is inherent goodness. That's what objectivity means. It's independent. It's cognition independent. It's independent of your personal belief. These values are considered objective. Why? Because they transcend individual cultures and personal preferences. They form the moral foundation necessary for the survival of society, as they promote justice, stability, and cooperation among individuals. Historically, um, societies have neglected universal moral values. Sorry, historically, societies that have neglected universal moral values have struggled to maintain stability. The downfall of authoritarian regimes, for example, often illustrates the dangers of ignoring basic human rights and moral principles. These historical lessons remind us that universal moral values are not merely theoretical constructs, but practical necessities for the survival and flourishing of any society. Finally, when assessing the morality of actions, it is important to consider not just the action itself, okay, but also the intentions and the context that surrounds it. Two individuals may perform the same action, but their moral judgment could differ based on the motivations and the broader circumstances. In technical terms, actions are rarely judged in isolation. Instead, the moral agent's character, the moral agent's intent, and the context that he or she is in play crucial roles in determining the moral weight of their actions. Right. There's this crucial principle we must understand: the principle of double effect. Okay? The principle of double effect is particularly relevant when a doctor must make difficult decisions. For example, if administering pain relief to a terminally ill patient may also hasten their death, okay? Administering that pain relief is morally justifiable. Is that true in all cases? No. It's only true if the doctor's intention is solely to relieve the pain, and the death is the unintended consequence of the act. This principle helps us navigate complex moral situations where good and bad outcomes are intertwined. Okay, emphasizing the importance of intention in moral evaluation. We also have to understand the difference between a human act and an act of man for a while. Okay, I see now. It's the order. It's the problem. The distinction between a human act on the one hand and an act of man plays a crucial role in determining whether an act is morally evaluable. A human act, by its very nature, involves conscious deliberation and intention, making it subject to moral scrutiny. Right? Okay, in contrast, so that's a human act. Okay? It's conscious, okay? It's deliberate, it's intentional, and therefore it is subject to moral scrutiny. In contrast, an act of man refers to actions that occur without deliberate choice, like, for example, instinctive or reflexive behaviors, which lack moral relevance. Moral relevance. Why? Because they are not born out of free will. This distinction is crucial when we assess moral responsibility because only actions that are performed with intention can be truly evaluated in terms of morality. Now, feelings. Feelings occupy a nuanced position in moral decision making. They can either aid or obstruct our ability to make sound moral choices. On the one hand, feelings may prompt us to act with compassion or empathy, aligning our actions with our moral ideas. But on the other hand, feelings can mislead us, driving impulsive decisions that might lack rational backing. Therefore, feelings are not irrelevant, but they must be balanced with reason and deliberation to ensure that they contribute constructively to moral choices. In any just society, the concept of impartiality is a cornerstone of fairness. To be impartial means to set aside personal biases, traditions, and even subjective inclinations, making decisions that are rooted in fairness and objectivity. It demands that one evaluates situations based on their merits rather than based on personal relationships or social pressures. Impartiality ensures that justice is administered consistently, which is essential in ethical and legal reasoning. Another concept is moral courage, because it is a trait that transcends mere fairness. Moral courage requires standing up for what is right, even when doing so is difficult or unpopular. Acting with moral courage means confronting uncomfortable truths or resisting pressure to conform to unethical norms. It is not about seeking conflict, but about having the fortitude to uphold principles despite opposition. Emotions often arise instinctively in moral situations, okay, influencing how we perceive and how we react to moral dilemmas. These emotions, or moral feelings, are actually distinct, right? Obviously, from intellectual judgments and play a role in our immediate responses to situations of right and wrong. They are a part of our natural moral apparatus, though they actually, as stated earlier, they require careful reflection to ensure that they lead us towards just actions. Let's go to some of the key concepts from Sokolowski, which you read um, for part two, which is about the moral action. A material action becomes a moral transaction, according to Sokolowski, when it is imbued with intentionality. It is not simply the physical performance of the act that carries the moral weight, okay? But it is instead the intentional structure that is behind it. The agent's recognition of the act as a moral event and the intentionality with which it is performed are what transform a mere action into a morally relevant one. Sokolowski distinguishes between chosen actions and voluntary actions. A chosen action is one that involves conscious reflection and decision making, while a voluntary action may be something done without deep consideration, but still within the realm of personal control. This very thin distinction helps clarify how we assign moral responsibility, as chosen actions reflect a deeper level of moral engagement compared to actions that are merely voluntary. Still, from Sokolowski, imagination, according to Sokolowski, plays a critical role in decision making by allowing us to envision various possibilities and potential outcomes. It is through imagination that we can reflect on different courses of action before making a choice, providing a mental space where ethical deliberation can occur. This capacity for imagination is what allows us to foresee the moral implications of our decisions before they materialize in reality. According to Sokolowski, um, when it comes to transforming a physical action into a moral act, we need to recognize the importance of the agent's recognition and intention. A physical act, according to Sokolowski, devoid of intentionality, remains just that, a physical performance. Intentionality, by the way, is a concept that Sokolowski borrows from Husserl. It is the agent's conscious acknowledgement of the moral significance of their action and their intention behind it that elevates it into the moral realm. Building on Husserl's framework, Sokolowski refers to, I quote, empty intention as a thought of an action that has not yet been performed. This notion represents the preliminary stage of moral action where the intention exists but has not yet been actualized, still an empty intention. The process of filling this intention through action marks the transition from mere contemplation to moral engagement. Our moral actions, according to Sokolowski, are primarily shaped by our character. While external circumstances and emotions may influence us, it is the moral fabric of our character, the values and the virtues that we cultivate over time, that fundamentally directs our actions. This is why moral education and self reflection are key in developing a moral life. For Sokolowski, a moral transaction, another key concept, occurs when an act involves another person. When an action engages someone else, it moves beyond personal morality and enters the realm of ethical relationships. This underscores the social nature of morality, where our actions are not just about personal principles, but also about how we relate to others in the moral community. Simple voluntary actions, according to Sokolowski, when done for their own sake, are considered intrinsic. Why? Because they are performed not for any external reward or any ulterior motive, but they're just done because they are inherently valuable or good. Intrinsic actions often reflect a deep alignment between one's moral beliefs and behaviors. Sokolowski now talks about hermeneutic triangulation as well. Okay, take note. It's constituted by hermeneutic triangulation involves purpose, substitution, and concatenation. These are factors that shape how we interpret and make sense of experiences and actions in a moral context. Finally, we're nearing the close of this review. The rhetorical purpose of speech involves more than just describing reality. It aims to achieve a specific effect on the audience. Rhetoric, as a tool of persuasion, uses words not only to communicate information, but to influence emotions, thoughts, and even actions of others. It is through this strategic use of language, okay, in rhetoric that we engage in moral discourse, persuading others to adopt ethical positions or recognize moral truths. And it's this rhetoric, okay, is one of the crucial aspects um, in moral action, again, which is one of the elements that we have to consider um, in evaluating a moral act. We're now in our very last section. Wherein we have to go back to Aristotle. Aristotle argued that the purpose, wait, Aristotle, here. Aristotle argued that the purpose or the telos of human life is happiness or eudaimonia, right? Not the fleeting kind of happiness found in wealth, power, or fame, but rather eudaimonia, which means even flourishing. Eudaimonia is achieved through a life of virtue. The ethics of Aristotle focuses on moderation, famously known as the golden mean, right? As you can recall from our discussions, where living virtuously means balancing extremes between the excess and um, the excess and the extreme lack, right? And aligning our actions with reason. This idea, embodied in the theory of golden mean, views virtue as between two vices. Okay, remember, virtue for Aristotle um, is just one of two types of habits, right? Habits are actions that are done in an extended period of time and are consistent for a long period of time. When it's a good habit, it's a virtue. When it's a bad habit, it's a vice, right? And for Aristotle, in this view of the golden mean, there are two vices, excess and deficiency. And virtue is navigating the thin line in the middle. Okay. This theory can be directly applied when analyzing situations where people act either excessively or insufficiently in their habits. Now, Kant has this approach which stands in stark contrast to the virtue ethics of Aristotle. Kant's categorical imperative calls on us to act according to maxims that we would want to be universal laws. Okay, this is the universalizability principle, right? In short, for Kant, actions are good if they are done according to a maxim that is applicable to everyone. So you can recall, the morality of an action for Kant is not judged by its consequences, right? As you can recall, it's a truly problem, right? But by the principle or the intention or the maxim that that is behind it. This idea is evident when evaluating actions like making a false promise. For Kant, for example, such an action is morally wrong, not because of the outcome it produces, but because um, the very concept of promising would lose its meaning if everyone were to make false promises. Thus, the principle behind the action, rather than the outcome or the result or the consequence, holds moral weight for Kant and his deontological view. We talked about virtue ethics, okay? Then we talked about deontology in Kant. We're down to the third of the four major ethical views, which is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism shifts the focus to the outcomes. Remember, in deontology, it's not the outcome, it's the principle or the maxim behind the action, right? Behind the act itself. Whereas in utilitarianism, you shift the focus to the consequence, to the outcome. In short, is the outcome good? If the outcome is good, then the action is itself good. Okay, that's the view of utilitarianism. You look at the consequence. It's a consequentialist theory, meaning that the moral worth of an action is judged by its consequences. The goal, according to utilitarianism, is to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. This principle can be applied to various ethical dilemmas, such as imposing a tax on the wealthy to fund public health care, right? Because the number of rich people is very few compared to the huge number of people who will benefit from public health care. Or, like, for example, deciding whether to pass a student under the threat of harm. A utilitarian would justify the decision if it increases overall happiness, even if it causes a reduction in happiness for a smaller group, such as the wealthy or even the teacher under duress. Now, justice. Justice, especially in the context of distributive justice, is another major theme in moral philosophy. In a capitalist model, justice is often linked to merit, where resources and privileges are distributed based on one's achievements or contributions. However, theories of fairness, such as those proposed by John Rawls, by the way, we'll still tackle John Rawls in more detail after the midterms. These theories emphasize that true fairness requires ensuring equal opportunities for all, particularly benefiting the least advantaged. Remember, the least advantaged are not considered in the calculus in utilitarianism, right? But John Rawls has this particular eye in the least advantaged. This concept is essential to assessing policies in educational systems, like whether to grant privileges to top performing students. The various system not only reward merit, but also ensure that every student has an equal chance to succeed. Now, turning back to Aquinas, right, who borrowed from the concepts of Aristotle. Aquinas has this concept of natural law, right, which holds that moral principles are inherent in nature and are accessible through reason. According to Aquinas, these principles guide us in determining whether um, an act is right or wrong based on human nature's intrinsic purposes, the telos, right, which he borrows from Aristotle. This perspective contrasts with the positivist notion that laws are merely social agreements or merely government decrees. Instead, natural law is a theory that posits that certain moral truths exist independently of human-made laws. When we consider moral worth, Kant again provides clarity. Why? Um, Kant argues in his deontology that an action's moral worth does not depend on how we feel or the outcome it brings about, but rather on whether it is done from duty. For example, helping someone out of a sense of duty. Okay, when you do that and you do not have an intrinsic inclination to do so, meaning you're not doing it because it makes you happy. According to Kant, it has a greater moral value than doing so because it makes you feel good or when you do it because you expect something in return. This brings us to another concept from Kant, right? The role of duty in moral evaluation. Kant explains that our actions are morally valuable only if we act out of a sense of duty to uphold moral law, rather than because of personal desires or expected outcomes. This is already a reiteration of what we said earlier. This principle is particularly relevant when assessing difficult moral situations like making promises, blah blah blah. We contrast this with utilitarianism, okay, which again looks at the good of the majority instead of the rightness or wrongness of the act. Okay, there are some concepts that we have to review as well. We have, for example, moral courage, impartiality. Uh, just study the notes that I gave you. Good luck with the exam. Um, I'll not promise that it's very easy, but I tried to provide scaffolds to make it manageable for you. Just take note that we have four major parts of the exam. First, we have the key concepts, right? The introduction. Then we talked about the first element in moral evaluation, which is the moral agent, right? That's why we had to read about we had to read the paper by was that one paper about moral action, a moral agent. Then the second element is the third part of the exam, which is about moral action, where we had to read about Sokolowski's phenomenology of moral action. And then right at the end, the fourth part of the exam is the third element in ethical evaluation, which is um, the different ethical frameworks. We tackled the four major ones only, and we'll be tackling more next time. But try to understand really the underpinnings, the historical, philosophical underpinnings of the four major ones. What are they? They are virtue ethics from Aristotle, and the consequent natural law ethics that Aquinas derives from it. Second one, we talked about Kantian duty-based ethics or deontology. Then we talked about utilitarianism from Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And finally, the different theories of justice, particularly those anchored on the thought of John Rawls. That's it for now. Good luck in the exams. Bye bye.